Good afternoon, everyone. I want to first thank the Annenberg School for Communication and the Center for Global Communication Studies, and also the Project for Advanced Research in Global Communication for inviting me here to speak today. It's such a great honor to be back at Penn speaking here this afternoon, and I'm really excited to share these conclusions with you and to get your feedback and your criticisms and your questions about this work. The subject of the Arab Spring and the role of social media in the Arab Spring has received a lot of scholarly attention over the last few years. What I'd like to do today is to kind of walk us through the conclusions, the arguments that I deploy in Dissent and Revolution, and to think through how some of these arguments differ from other accounts of the Egyptian uprising in particular, and then to explain what I think are the key insights of the book and what I think the book offers when we consider questions of digital media and authoritarianism and collective action more generally. So when I began doing this work in 2006, the summer of 2006, I think it's very safe to say that most specialists in the politics of the Middle East regarded social media as at best a distraction from, and at worst really a sidetrack from the real work of understanding authoritarianism, right? So it was very hard to convince anyone in my own discipline that this was a variable that mattered when we want to think about politics and the effects of communication. I was at a dinner party that summer. This was the summer of '06. I was in Egypt, kind of looking for a dissertation topic, and I met that's how these things work, right? I can admit that. I met a blogger by the name of Hossam al-Hamalawi, and I thought he was really fascinating. And he explained to me the linkages between this very small group, loosely linked group of bloggers, and a umbrella coalition opposition group called Kifaya, and the protests that they were collaborating on that I'd actually seen a lot of that summer on the streets of Cairo. And they were protesting different policies of the Mubarak regime, including corruption and primarily the planned transfer of power from the aging dictator Hosni Mubarak to his son Gamal. And so I was like a voracious consumer of political blogs myself during that time period, at the height of the Bush administration. And I wondered whether these activists might be having any kind of an effect on politics in Egypt, right? Or whether they were, just as I think many people suspected, just kind of tilting at authoritarian windmills. So I formulated this research question, really kind of simple question, which is, what effect is the internet having on authoritarian rule in Egypt in particular? And I finished this project in 2010, and then the Arab Spring happened. So I went back and I wanted to ask also, of course, what role did digital media play in the Egyptian revolution itself? So I determined to return to Egypt in 2007 to conduct interviews with key participants in these struggles, and just to come to some conclusions about their effects. So after nearly 2 years in the field, I came to a series of, I guess, substantive conclusions about these questions. That I'll walk us through the arguments and the variables, and then I'll get to them more in depth later in the talk. The first of these conclusions is that during the time period that I was in Egypt, what the internet offered users was access to a largely unregulated public sphere. And that is a public sphere that did not have the same kinds of restrictions as other forms of media in Egypt. And that in using these opportunities, what individuals did was reveal grievances and preferences to one another. And that under certain conditions, particularly in conditions where it's difficult to speak your mind for fear of reprisal, the sort of the properties of social media could lead to what a lot of political scientists and sociologists have termed information cascades. That is, a sudden, widespread shift in public preferences about certain things. It was first applied to like fads, different trends in shoes or jeans, but has increasingly been applied to political events as well. This new public sphere, as it existed in Egypt at the time, was aggressively captured by a small number of elite bloggers and activists. And one of the key things that I talk about in this book is the way that those bloggers and activists work together with professionals in traditional media. That is, this is partially a story of the continued importance of traditional forms of media, and the way that the digital activists work together hand in hand, oftentimes unintentionally, and oftentimes even though the traditional media practitioners did not like these guys very much, but they did it. And what they did over time was they transformed discourse in Egypt around a small number of sort of consensus human rights issues that I think were really critical in that moment of crisis in 2011. And I think I can show you the way that discourse developed over time and then resulted in the things that we saw a couple of years ago. So in the 2008-2011 period, what we saw in Egypt was the emergence of new applications of social media, which are now, of course, deeply familiar to us, but were not at the time, but including and not limited to Facebook and Twitter, that allowed for the creation of new online social movements. And these new online social movements adopted increasingly confrontational street tactics to challenge key aspects of the Mubarak regime's authority. Right? And this is important. And I argue that far from arising suddenly, like out of nowhere, either in 2008 with the April 6th movement, which I'll explain in a few minutes, or in 2010, that we have to trace the digital origins of the Egyptian uprising back a full decade. That is, to ferment that was taking place in these emerging forums about the Second Intifada, about the US invasion of Iraq, and about ongoing practices of the authoritarian government in Egypt. So the argument here is that dissent and protest and contentious politics were cumulative, and that the 2011 moment could not really have happened exactly the way it happened without this decade of sort of digitally driven contention. So when I'm thinking about the way that I came up with these arguments, talk about a few key variables, okay? That allowed the digital activist community to have an influence that really exceeded its actual number of people that were doing this. So first of these variables is that the sort of dynamics of early adoption and the dynamics of networks themselves gave outsized importance to a small number of bloggers, journalists, and activists who were the first to use these tools and the first to become prominent by doing so. Okay? That gave them a huge advantage over other new entrants in the field, and that eventually this group of people came to refer to themselves as power bloggers. The second thing here that I want to point to is that the Mubarak regime, suppose this is a deeply authoritarian state circa 2003 when I started when I start looking at these things. They made a very interesting decision in 2003, 2004, and that is they liberalized the press environment. They granted licenses to a few key newspapers, print newspapers, one of which was called Al-Masri al-Yawm, Egypt Today, one of which was called Ad-Dustur, the Constitution. And this was I think, was a really momentous decision. I'd love for someone to do some competent theorizing about why an authoritarian state decided at this particular juncture in time to sort of open up the universe of criticism about itself. Right? Because I don't think anybody's had a very good explanation for why they did that. But the fact is that they did it. And it is the people that wrote for and worked for these new independently owned print media organizations that were able to take the things that were written by the bloggers, and it really was just bloggers back in 03, 04, and to catapult those things into a broader public sphere to which other people had access to. Okay. Finally, it was really the policies of the Egyptian state were important here too. Okay? Egypt is an outlier. And so it's the policies of the Egyptian state with regard to the activists, or I should say the near total lack thereof of any kind of organized attempt to interfere with the architecture of the internet. So I'm not saying that it didn't do anything to the activists, right, who were frequently thrown into prison and beaten up and harassed and blacklisted. But they never did anything, or they never made a sustained attempt to filter or censor or block content on the internet, as we've seen in other states and other authoritarian regimes do very successfully. So let me just talk about the theories. In the second chapter, I call this the theory of the networked revolt, and it draws on a bunch of different literatures. And I'll start off by saying that in 2008, 2009, in particular, there was a consensus, at least among those who studied Middle East politics, that the authoritarian states of the Middle East were durable or persistent. Or that the words of my colleague Joshua Stacker, that these were regimes that were adaptable autocrats, that they'd devised strategies of divide and rule that were quite successful and allowed these authoritarian elites to reproduce themselves over time with shifting coalitions, but with basically the same set of actors persisting through time and space. So people like Eva Balin, Julian Schwedler, Steve Heidemann, just to name a few, and I know this is not a political science audience, but I just want to emphasize that my folks thought that this was something that would persist throughout time and space. So one of my challenges in the work was to explain how this small community of people was able to, at the least, articulate grievances that captured popular attention. The theoretical apparatus of the book relies quite heavily on existing work in network theory popularized by thinkers like Duncan Watts, who were among the first to apply the concept of power laws to the internet. Right? That is, the idea that not all nodes in the internet are connected equally, and that many sites or actors on the internet have a really huge number of connections, but many of us, like my own Twitter account maybe has like four connections. That actually is I think that's a generous estimate. In doing that, I also relied on arguments by scholars like Timur Kuran, who talks about preference falsification under authoritarian rule. That is, the idea that we're afraid to reveal our true feelings about the state to others because either we're afraid our neighbors are going to rat us out, or we're afraid that we'll be harmed in some way. And so a key part of what I talk about here is the role of social media in allowing people to share their grievances and to share their preferences with one another. And that over time, the revelation of those preferences, and shocker, nobody particularly liked Mubarak-era authoritarianism when they started talking about it, that this was a key factor that led to an increased amount of contention, dissent, protest, and unrest in Egypt in the time period leading up to the revolution itself. So ultimately, the argument of the book is that under certain conditions, and particularly I think when those conditions persist over time, the expansion of the use of social media can undermine key factors of authoritarian stability. One of those factors is voluntary compliance, right? That is, authoritarianism really at heart can't always rest on constant repression, right? A stable authoritarian state must be able to get its citizens to voluntarily comply with its policies over time. It can't be in this like constant state of crisis where people have to be arrested and repressed and put into prison and killed. Okay? And the other is, of course, just control over the information environment. One of the key stories here is the way that in some ways, based on policies that it itself made, the Mubarak regime sacrificed its monopoly over the information environment. And together with other changes and other forms of media, including, of course, broadcast media and the Arab satellite television, all of these things together sort of put an end to that era where authoritarian regimes could really control what you saw and what you didn't see. Okay. So that is a lot of conceptual clutter. So let me walk us back in time a little bit to the beginning of this period. Look at the chronology here. There's been a lot of focus since the Arab uprisings on this like one 18-day period, right, in Tahrir Square. And there's been a lot of great work done, a lot of very interesting findings using data. But I think to really understand what happened in Egypt, you can't just focus on this big data collected in Tahrir Square in 2011, January 2011, and after. We got to go all the way back to, say, 2003. This is a time period when digital dissent largely consisted of blogs and bloggers. This is also the period when the free blogs kind of gone out of fashion a little bit, but you know, remember the free blogger platform really, it's like the first off-the-shelf technology that you can just, as a person that knows nothing about computing, you can just go to the site and start your own self-publishing platform. Right? And I can't emphasize enough how revolutionary this was in Egypt at the time, because if you wanted to be on the internet prior to the release of Blogger, you had to make your own site. As what I call the grandfather of Egyptian blogging, a guy named Tariq Atiyah, did this way back before any of this started. He had a website called Cairo Live in 1995 that was a kind of a precursor to the sort of criticism that we saw online later in Egypt. And I think that the agenda, even back then, was clear. Right? Tariq Atiyah told me in an interview when I talked to him in 2007, and he was speaking about actually his own site from the 1990s. And he said, the key function is to re-engineer or re-establish news priorities. Right? It's basically a window for readers to see that the news priorities that traditional news authorities present to them is not the paradigm that they have to function on. Right? So from the very beginning, the bloggers saw themselves as challengers to state information control and state news control. And I think in many ways they were very successful at this. But the problem with this, as I mentioned before, is that very few people were actually online in Egypt at this time. This is a chart from that talks about the number of people that were using, the percentage of people that were using the internet in Egypt on any given year. One of the things I think this chart shows is that I made the correct career choice and that I do not have a future in graphic design, because this is the best that I could do. I'm sorry. I played around with the internet for hours. Even though I study it, I'm not that good at it. So here it is. As you can see, this is the reason, like this chart is the reason that at least in my own discipline, I often got kind of like laughed out of the room when I said I wanted to go study bloggers in Egypt, right? They would say to me, Faris, who cares about a technology that only like 10% of the people that you want to study have access to? How could that possibly be important? Right? This is crazy. I think there's a lot of other more important things you could be studying, and not to say that there weren't. But you can see here that even in the early stages of the period under study here, and even in 2008 when we get the April 6th movement, the internet is still like an elite, wealthy, driven phenomenon. And it's not something that everyone has access to. Partially because of cost, and partially just because some of the infrastructure hadn't yet been put into place by the government. So the story that I tell here is one about symbiosis. And again, it goes back to the decision to grant licenses to this small number of independently owned newspapers. In 2004, this daily newspaper, Al Masri Al Yom, starts publishing. And the contrast with the state-owned press is really stark. If you go through the archives of like Al Ahram from the time, the typical front page story on Al Ahram is like President Mubarak sitting around and talking to someone, and just like stenography about what was said. Right? There's not a ton of criticism carried in these papers. And then all of a sudden, in the same places in the same kiosks where you buy the state newspapers, you see publications like Masri Al Yom that are carrying a very, very different form of news. It was like a simulacrum of news production in democratic society. And it carried really frank criticism of the government. And these papers were willing to do things like challenge established regime narratives. One of the first things that happened when I got back to Cairo in 2007 to do the research was that when I arrived in Cairo, President Mubarak was like missing. No one had seen him for weeks. He had gone into occultation or something, and nobody really knows. But the state newspapers were completely silent about this. Or they would, he's resting up, he's on vacation or something. But they couldn't produce him. Like no one could actually produce the president and put him on a stage and say like, here he is, he's fine, see? Don't worry. And that's just sort of just like the essence of authoritarianism there, right? Where regime elites don't even have to tell you whether the leader of the state is alive. And it's these new print journalists who are writing things that ask the questions that no one was thought you were allowed to ask before, which is the president dead? Right? There were weeks of stories about either is the president dead or is the president dying, and they arrested the editor of Ad Dustur for writing these stories and publishing them. But the key thing is they didn't actually stop doing it. Right? This was a familiar pattern where the regime would do something repressive to this new set of elites, these new journalists, but then ultimately would not follow through by either closing the publications or shutting down the sites. So it's during this time period that a familiar pattern emerged that I saw in the research. That is, these bloggers would break a story, like they'd be physically present for something. And one of the first and most famous of these is there was this really terrible mass sexual assault in downtown Cairo in October of 2006 that had apparently happened before, but this time just so happened that a couple of key bloggers, including a guy who went by the name Melik X and then Violet Bess, were present for the event. They captured it on film, and then they wrote about it relentlessly for weeks. Right? It was not covered in the state-owned newspapers. It was not even initially covered in these newly legalized independent press outlets. It was only the bloggers. They were the only people writing about this. And then finally, their efforts are rewarded when the independent media breaches this state silence and starts reporting on things. So in the case of the sexual harassment, this led to like wall-to-wall coverage for several weeks in Masr al-Yawm and Dastur, these new print organizations. And it led to street protests organized by the bloggers in conjunction with some of the offline organizations and calls for the resignation of the interior minister. This did not happen, of course, but it was remarkable that these things were, this kind of contention was happening, right? It was unusual. Perhaps I think, though, the most important single issue area pushed by the activists was about torture. And about the sort of these like endemic practices of assault, rape, cruelty, impunity inside of Egypt's prisons, which had been going on for decades, but which, of course, did not receive a lot of press attention prior to this period of liberalization and the diffusion of the internet. The iconic case here that I read about in the book concerns the case of a bus driver named Ahmed El-Kabir, who was arrested for basically no reason. He was trying to interfere with the harassment of his cousin by the police. And then he was brought into an Egyptian prison, and this is really terrible, but he was like brutally raped on film. And one of the practices of Egyptian police at the time was they would use cell phone cameras to record the abuse that they were committing. And for whatever reason, a video of this assault leaked into the blogosphere, right? Not into the press, into the blogosphere, where the video was published and put online by some of these key blogging elites, and they wrote about it. They wrote about it relentlessly. And again, just like in the sexual harassment story, it's collaboration. It's actually, they didn't know who this was. So this is Ahmed El-Kabir, but when Violet Bess put this video up on his site, he actually didn't know who the guy was. Nobody did, right? It was just like this anonymous video of someone being tortured really, really terribly. And it was print media journalists from one of these. It was actually a less known paper called Al Fagr, but they tracked him down. They figured out who he was, and they convinced him to file suit in court against the officers who had done this to him. And in a really unprecedented move, because there was protests happening about this, because the papers were writing about it constantly, they decided to prosecute the officers responsible for the torture, which is, just like, did not happen during this time period. And they were prosecuted and they were sentenced to several years in prison. But what I would argue is that more important than the resolution of this one single case was the increasing importance of torture as like a symbolic representation of the Mubarak regime's venality, and the dedication of even more bloggers and journalists to exposing it. One of the things worth highlighting here are sites like, there's one site called Tazib fi Masr, that is torture in Egypt, that was run by a young woman named Noha Atef. And one of the thing that she did that was really revolutionary was that she would go around the country interviewing victims of torture. And she would put their stories online. Sometimes she would take videos of the things that were done to them. And then there was a whole section of the website naming the names of the officers that were responsible for this torture. And you can just imagine the kind of bravado that this took in 2007 Egypt to go around exposing the crimes of people that could do the same thing to you if they wanted to. And then again, in an enduring mystery, they did nothing to her. Right? Noha was allowed to continue to do her work, and her work and those of several other bloggers who ran similar sites were really instrumental in pioneering a set of discursive strategies that pushed public discourse in a small number of spheres. Right? So they were on the scene to do this kind of work, just breaking stories or documenting abuses. Right. Another iconic case was there was a group of Sudanese refugees in Cairo who were camped out in a place called Mohammed Mahmoud Square, and they were asking for the state to do things for them, right? To help them out in some way and not to keep them in this limbo. And they were kind of trapped in the square. They didn't know where to go. And rumors started filtering through that the security services were about to come in. This was in 2006. That the security services were about to come in and like clear them out. Another young woman named Nora Yunus, who's like, a lot of these people were also journalists and bloggers at the same time, right? So it kind of complicates the picture here. But Nora decided she would just like go to the square, find a good place to watch it, and then document it. So what she did, so she went to the top of an apartment building and she filmed and took pictures of the security services, like using really brutal methods to clear the refugees out of the square. And then wrote this really long, heartbreaking account of it. Again, and this was also a familiar pattern, nothing really changed for the refugees at the time, right? So people looked at this ferment and they said, well, if you can't even get the interior minister to resign, or you can't actually win any rights for the refugees, this is cute and all, but it's not actually changing anything. But I would argue that the bloggers in particular instances did things that even the print journalists would not do, even the independent print journalists would not do. And one of these cases is there's an island called Khorsaya in Cairo, which is like the last untouched piece of territory in Cairo. It looks nothing like the rest of Cairo. This is a fascinating little, and of course you can see like the army elites with their economic connections looking at this and like salivating as a development opportunity to be put into the sort of military economic industrial complex there. But people live there, sort of like poor farmers and fishermen. It's not many people, but enough to make a difference. So the regime, as this was like a hallmark of Mubarak-era authoritarianism, they would just announce that they were going to do something with it, right? So in 2007, they announced that they were going to clear everyone off of this island and then do something with it, right? Not clear what exactly they were going to do, but it probably involved the army bringing in its connections in the tourism industry and then changing it for good. And so it was bloggers like a guy named Mina Zekri who were the only ones willing to name names, to say like the print journalists would not touch the word army, right? Because that could get you in a lot of trouble. It's one of the few things that really would get the journalists thrown into prison for a significant amount of time. But the bloggers just did it. They did it with impunity. He wrote this long post that was like, look, the army is going to come in and clear out this island, right? That's what was going to happen, right? But it was very unusual for anyone to actually say it out loud. So again, not all these efforts were successful, but I think that cumulatively they created a public sphere that became more accustomed to challenging particular narratives of the regime and to organizing protests that were seen throughout this period as small and insignificant, but I think that over time conditioned people to seeing protest and to thinking of it as more of a part of normal life than it had been. Okay. By 2008, I think Egypt had evolved a much more complex ecology of digital activism. Again, with the thing about graphic design, this is the best I could do. There's circles. I'm getting there. I still think in 2008, the small group of people that had started doing this work in the early 2000s were still the most important activists in Egypt, but they were augmented. They were being augmented by groups on Twitter, groups on Facebook, and some of these other emerging pieces of the information ecology. One of those was, of course, that many of the independent newspapers were starting to come online too, right? Initially just like, dumping content, but increasingly producing original content for the web that didn't exist in the print versions. There were new online newspapers that existed only online, like Yom 7, and then there's your photo and video sharing sites that we're all, I think, familiar with by this point. So these activists, and particularly on Facebook, were using what Clay Shirky once called the ridiculously easy group formation tools to formulate these new, what I call new online social movements. Right? And it's in 2008 when veteran activists from this offline opposition group called Kifaya, the sort of the youth wing of Kifaya called Youth for Change. They decided to start a Facebook group in support of planned industrial labor action in the city of Mahalla on April 6, 2008. Okay. And I would argue that even though that day is still, I think, seen as a failure by people who observed it, I think it changed politics in Egypt forever. The young activists who created this group were quickly joined by 70,000 people who joined the group and pledged to take part in that day's actions. Does not seem like much from today's vantage point, but 70,000 people on Facebook in Egypt in 2008 was like a really big deal, and got the regime's attention immediately. And they said anybody that stays home, participates in this strike, will be fired if you work for the state, and sort of made it seem like there was a big confrontation brewing. And as it turns out, the big confrontation on that day was actually in Mahalla between the striking laborers and the state. And not all that terribly much happened in Cairo, other than that these guys got a lot of press attention and got some experience in running protests and challenging the regime and in getting arrested. Because many of the leading activists of what became known as the April 6th movement were arrested, and then it's like catch and release, right? So they arrest them and they beat them up, and then the idea is that you are chastened and you will no longer do these things, but of course that didn't work. So one of the important things about April 6th was that they adopted many of the key demands of Kifaya, that is the older opposition group. And they adopted many of the tactics of the color revolutionaries, the movements that swept through Eastern Europe in the late 1990s and early 2000s, including, and importantly, the raised fist here that you see in the April 6th logo. That is not theirs. That was originally designed for Otpor, the sort of umbrella resistance group that ultimately brought down the Milosevic government in Serbia in 1999, and then swept through Georgia, Ukraine, and some other places. And they adopted some of these tactics of nonviolent confrontation with the state that are recommended by a guy named Gene Sharp and some of the organizations that he has worked with over time. I think it's also worth noting here that in the 2008-2010 period, labor unrest reaches like a fever pitch in Egypt. So hundreds of thousands of Egyptian workers participated in work actions during this time period. And this new alliance between the young, like LinkedIn digital activists of Cairo and the industrial labor movement, I think was to have really important consequences when that real moment of crisis hit in January 2011. So it's in this increasingly highly networked, highly evolved, but loosely linked network that the mobilization took place in 2011. I just want to take a second to note the way that print journalists viewed these developments and the way that print journalists increasingly during this time period used the blogs and used these digital sources as a news source. Right? So I was there on April 6, 2008. I did kind of like a cop-style ride-along with the activists as they were trying to evade the cops. And then I went to the headquarters of Masri al-Yawm on the 7th, and I asked the deputy editor about sort of like the way that the organization interfaced with the tools of social media when trying to cover April 6th. And this is what he said to me, which is basically instead of opening his own newspaper, the first thing he did when he woke up on the 7th was to look at Twitter and to look at the blogs and to look at Facebook. And he claimed, although some of his journalists denied this, he claimed that basically everyone in the office was doing the same thing, right? And it was kind of a point of pride at that point for journalists to deny that they harvested stories from the bloggers, but this was, I think, I would argue very strongly that this was actually what was happening. So I'm going to fast forward, because I'm starting to run out of time, I think. I'm going to fast forward a couple of years to June 2010. That summer in Alexandria, a young man named Khaled Saeed was brutally beaten and killed by police in front of horrified onlookers in Alexandria. Well, he wasn't killed immediately. He was beaten up and he was taken to the station and tortured and killed. And then his body was dumped back with his family. And then one of these like really up is down hallmarks of Mubarak authoritarianism, the story that they told the family was that he had swallowed a bag of marijuana and died. And I don't actually think anybody's ever died from swallowing a bag of marijuana, first of all, but his family released pictures of what had happened to him, and he had obviously been beaten to death. And so this was just obviously untrue, right? Obviously untrue in a way that you can't do in this era anymore. And so far from inventing a discourse of torture out of thin air, the creators of a Facebook group called We Are All Khaled Saeed, which had both English and Arabic components or different pages, what they did was they seized on this like mature environment of dissent and activism that had evolved over the course of 10 years. And they tapped into a previously articulated set of grievances over police practices in Egypt. And over the course of the summer and the fall of 2010, We Are All Khaled Saeed linked up with the veteran April 6th organizers to stage a series of symbolic protests in Alexandria and Cairo that indicted the practices of the Egyptian regime and drew over 400,000 people into the We Are All Khaled Saeed Facebook page prior to the uprising, which is a lot of people by any accounting. And at the same time as this is happening, new tools are being created in Egypt. And in fact, I think that we see a couple of creatures in Mubarak's labyrinth that are actually new forms of news production and new forms of media. One of those is called the Rasid News Network, RNN, which is a volunteer news consortium that for a long time consisted entirely of Facebook and Twitter posts. That is, this was the entire operation. There was no website, there was no TV, there was no money. It was just a group of friends who collaborated together to channel reports from different parts of Egypt about the 2010 parliamentary elections. Initially, this was the idea behind the project. So in 2010, the Mubarak regime decided to crack down on even the limited sort of political opposition that it had allowed over the past 10 years, and to eliminate it in these elections. And the opposition saw this coming, the Brotherhood saw this coming, and they mobilized to do a few things about it. One of those things was Rasid News that was able to get reports out of different parts of the country about electoral abuses. They worked with, this was the first time I'd seen crisis mapping or live mapping deployed in Egypt, where you're collating sort of geographic information systems data to produce a data visualization of the different things that are happening at polling stations all over the country. So the rigging of these elections was well documented. And I just want to say that before anything happened in Tunisia, this sort of coalition of digital activists had already envisioned 2011 as what they called the year of departure. That is, the year that we were going to get rid of Mubarak, and or the year that we were going to prevent Mubarak from transferring power to his son Gamal, right? Saying like, this is actually not a hereditary monarchy, this is a republic, so what are we doing here? So there's all sorts of ferment happening in Egypt. I would argue a lot of it is digital. So after the spark of the Arab Spring was lit in Tunisia, organizers from We Are All Khaled Saeed plotted the date of the first protest, that is January 25th, 2011. They did this openly on their Facebook page. You can actually scroll through the archive if you have a lot of time. You can scroll through I did this. You scroll through the Arabic language archives of the page, and you can see the whole conversation that they had about when to have the protest. Just like, should we do it on this day? I don't know, what do you think? It's a good idea? Yeah, sure, police day. It'd be like Orwellian, haha, joke, irony, right? Importantly, they didn't actually expect it to turn into an immediate broad-based uprising that overthrew the government. But some of the veteran activists consciously adopted grassroots strategies. They meticulously planned crowd-building strategies, and they got out of the internet cafes and they went and talked to people to try to get them to join in to the protests. So by the time January 25th, 2011 approached, tens of thousands of Egyptians had committed online through this group to participating in those protests. And then the ground level organizing was very successful by a variety of online and offline groups. The key thing that I would keep in mind here is the increasing density of digital networks at the time, right? And according to Reed's law, the more people are using these networks, the more valuable they are. So that the same kind of writing and dissent that might have reached 20% of the population in 2008 is now going to reach 40, 50, or 60% of the population through the conjunction of these networks. Okay? As one of these activists told me, he said, of course, the offline stuff had a huge impact. Of course, Tunisia had a huge impact. But, he said, we created the crisis. In other words, we plotted it. It was our idea. I know the name of the guy whose idea this was, right? This is the actual person who started We Are All Khaled Saeed, which is a lot of people have gotten this wrong. So what I would say is that they may have capitalized on an opportunity that was created for them by the success of the Tunisian revolution. In other words, that may have convinced a lot of people that, like, yeah, it actually is possible to force one of these authoritarian leaders in the Arab world into exile. But I don't think that opportunity would have been there in Egypt had it not been for years of effort, organizing, and sacrifice. The story of the uprisings themselves, comparatively, I think has been well told by other thinkers and other scholars. But I would suffice to say that I think that digital media played a key causal role. I would also finally like to address the role of state policies in this analysis. After the book was published, I created a kind of a typology of different state practices with regard to the internet during this time period. I just want to emphasize again just what an outlier Egypt was, right? And the way that I think that some of the dynamics that we saw in terms of challenging authoritarian practices in Egypt may not be precisely reproducible in other places because there's a lot of variables at play here. Egypt is what I call a response regime. That is, instead of censoring and filtering, you confine yourself to piecemeal harassment of the activists themselves. Right? And that allowed the flowering of this digital activist community that developed. They all knew each other. Many of them started blogs for one another. They shared technical expertise. And for the most part, they operated out in the open. They're like, this is my name, this is my blog, I want to bring down the government, right? And they never really stopped them. So this is so unusual. In what I call a control regime, as in Tunisia, the state filters and censors extensively, using largely off-the-shelf filtering technology, oftentimes from the West, and that creates a different kind of digital community, right? It forces a lot of activists into exile, so that the most important Tunisian site was actually produced in France. It was called Nawat. Importantly, it restricts access to the materials so that it just doesn't diffuse as widely. But those to whom it does diffuse are those who are able to learn how to evade these practices. So what activists in Tunisia told me, they were like, what it did was it forced us to learn how to use circumvention tools and to learn how to use proxy tools. And they were like, you know what, by 2010, we were really good at that. They taught us how to do that. We learned it by watching you. It's that old drug commercial. Who taught you how to do this stuff? Finally, I think there are what I call digital cordon states. Okay, that is those states that seek to erect an entirely separate architecture of online information. And I think that we're seeing these efforts come to fruition in places like China and like Iran to a lesser extent. I think Saudi Arabia. But where you're not going to go search on Google, you're going to go to an entirely separate search engine that's separated from the rest of the web architecturally. If you've ever tried to search for the Tiananmen Square massacre on the Chinese search engine Baidu, you'll see, of course, that Tiananmen was a myth. And these are actually very interesting and successful practices. That is, the state has put up just a cordon, like a wall between users and the rest of the internet. It's not that there's no internet, it's just that it's different, right? Whereas in Tunisia, there's much less internet. There's the same amount of internet in Iran and China, it's just you don't have access to the same stuff. And I'm not in any way an expert on China, so I want to stop talking about it before I embarrass myself. But the argument in the book is that Egypt's uniquely liberal internet response regime allowed for the formation of this open network of dissent that evolved and grew in importance over time, and then importantly provided this spark for a broad-based uprising. I think I'm almost finished. This analysis is shared by, I think, many, but not all, thinkers who have looked at the events of the Arab Spring. I think scholarship is kind of split between those who, I'm not going to narrate this all, it would be boring, but I just wanted to convince you that I've read a lot of this stuff. That scholarship is deeply split between those who attribute an important causal role to social media and those who are more skeptical. But overall, I think even those of us who attribute an important causal role agree with those who don't in more ways than we disagree, right? Gadi Wolfsfeld has said, politics comes first. We have to look at it contextually. I don't disagree with that at all. Right? I think that there are a number of important causal variables here, including unmet economic expectations and social frustration and corruption that was increasingly being exposed over the course of the 2000s. So the argument here is that that Egyptian digital activism is a long-term historical process. That's what I wanted to emphasize here. I wanted to historicize this a little bit. I wanted to highlight the key role of print media elites. Right? I think that those of us who study social media need to not forget about other forms of media. I think satellite TV was also very important during this time period. It's just not something I really treated in the book. And importantly, I wanted to explain the role of these online social movements in conditioning the Egyptian public for protest and contention, and repeatedly triggering these cascades of information and contestation. Comparatively, I think the different outcomes of many of these mobilizations that were affected by social media in different ways, right? In Tunisia, social media was also important, it just didn't cause the crisis. That the different outcomes of these struggles in places like Tunisia and Syria and Iran shows that the mobilization is not determinative, right? You can mobilize people but then not succeed in changing state authoritarian structures, right? We have to think back to politics. We have to think to why the Green Movement, despite the massive mobilization, was unable to change the fundamental architecture of the state. Well, I guess 6 months ago I would have said the Egyptians were able to do that, and now I'm really not so sure anymore because the events of the past year have been very dispiriting, although I don't think changes the fundamental story I'm telling here about mobilization. And I just want to finally make a plea for the importance of interview-driven qualitative research as a complement to data-driven analysis. In my view, some of these analyses, if they were just based on the numbers, might have missed some of the key contributions of Egyptian digital activists. They might not have showed up in the Twitter or the Facebook data. Some of these key bloggers never had the kind of readership that would show up in an Alexa ranking, right? Their influence came from other directions. And I think that the big data work is super important. I saw a lot of it when I went to the American Political Science Association's pre-conference, and several scholars from Annenberg were presenting really marvelous data. But I think that we need to work together to produce the best kind of analysis that uses both the interview methods and also big data. I think I'm a little over time, so I will be quiet now. Thank you all for coming and for